I have the privilege of introducing our communicator, or speaker this morning. Many of you probably know Nathan Cantu. If you don't know Nathan, and you've been a part of this church for years, then you've been influenced and affected by Nathan with his work in content development, curriculum development. Really what we get to hear and experience on Sunday morning a lot of times comes from just his head and his heart and the way that God's gifted, uniquely wired him. Nathan, years ago, I won't say how many years, but years ago, started as a resident here at Waymaker.Church and got to be developed and grown. And then a couple years ago, when we knew as a church that there had to be a better way to equip and empower the next generation of leaders in the local church, we launched an academic program. And I'll tell you what, there is no other man that could have pulled off what we were able to pull off of building an academic program, classes from the ground up, where students could be trained, not just for their minds to be filled, but their lives to be transformed. And Nathan was able to get together a team of people, as the academic director of Waymaker Institute, the classes that he helped to form and shape will influence and equip leaders long after he's gone. And so it is an honor to serve with him. Not only that, but he is the professor of our New Testament and Old Testament survey classes, cultural engagement, and academics 101. So he is a special man. Not only that, but he's a great communicator that I am so excited to sit under his leadership and his authority this morning. He has an incredible family, his wife Rachel and his son Lee. That's right, they're my favorite people. So, would you join me in welcoming Nathan Cantu? I love you, brother.
Thanks, man. What am I supposed to say after that? Brett, thanks. Brett was actually the one who offered me the opportunity to come on staff as a resident. And so everything that I have been able to do has been because of his leadership and mentorship. So thanks. Let's dive in, right? Today we're in week 2 of our Christmas series. If you couldn't figure that out with the lights and the red and the Christmas songs, it's Christmas. And normally Christmas is kind of one of those where it's like, yeah, Christmas, but 2020 has kind of put a damper on that. This series is called Hope is Here, which, if I'm honest, feels a little disingenuous in 2020. Because, what sort of hope are we supposed to talk about at the end of a really, really long and rough year? And a lot of the times when Christmas comes around, Christmas is kind of this shot in the arm, right? We sit here and we're like, it's Christmas, the calendar's gonna swap, it's gonna be a new year, right? Like parties and gifts and New Year's and resolutions that we're gonna ignore, and then life will be better in 2021. And not to be Debbie Downer from the stage, but life is not gonna get better in 2021, right? The things that have been revealed to us in 2020, the spiritual battles that we've encountered, the difficulties that we face, the dysfunction that has been revealed in our souls, and the posture of our hearts is not magically going to change on January 1st. So yay, Christmas. But in that, we have a different sort of hope. Our hope this Christmas and any Christmas is not this short-term lights, trees, hooray, moving on hope. We have a far deeper and more powerful hope that's what this series is actually talking about. Because in this series, we're talking about how hope is here, not based on Christmas, 8-pound, 12-ounce baby Jesus, but how hope is here because of the character of the God that we serve. And so we're walking through these four attributes of God that we see in Isaiah chapter 9 and talking about how they don't just shape our hope for Christmas or for 2021, but they shape our hope for our life and for our death and for eternity after that. I'm so excited to talk about what it looks like for God to be our mighty God today. But before we do that, would you pray with me as we jump into this? God, would you open our mouths today so that our lips can declare your praise? God, we know that you are a mighty God. Heaven is your throne room and the earth is your footstool. But God, it is hard to believe that some days. And so today, as we give you the praise and the adoration and the allegiance that you deserve, would you meet with us? God, would you make blind eyes that are in this room that cannot see how you are a mighty God, would you make those eyes open? Would you bring dead hearts back to life? And in this, would you prepare us to walk out into a world that is dark and afraid and a battleground? But would you allow us to walk out as people of hope, as Easter people who laugh at death? We pray this in your name. Amen. So today we're going to be in Isaiah chapter 9. When you plan a Christmas series and you get ready to preach, there are only two options. It's either Luke 2, shepherds, babies, angels, or it's Isaiah. This year we chose Isaiah. So Isaiah chapter 9, for unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be on his shoulder. And his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. Now, when we read this passage as 21st century American Christians, we think Christmas, right? Because, again, it's one of our two options. But when Isaiah's audience first heard this message, this was not a Christmas message. Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, is writing 700 years before Jesus is born to an audience that is looking for hope, but looking for hope for a very different reason than we approach this passage when it comes time to read it in December when we're not reading Luke 2. What Isaiah is doing is Isaiah is speaking into a moment of crisis in the nation of Israel's history. See, when Isaiah gives this message of hope, Israel is facing internal and external pressure. Internally, not just pressure, but crisis. See, internally, Israel's king is worthless. The previous couple chapters of Isaiah are really just Isaiah bashing Israel's king Ahaz and talking about how he's lost a major war, he's made some really, really dumb trade decisions, he's actually financing a lot of his stupid economic policies by looting gold from the temple, and he's leading the nation into idolatry. So that's not bad enough. Isaiah also is talking about how the nation of Israel is facing an external crisis because the nation of Assyria has all of a sudden become this global superpower, and their king, Tiglath-Pileser, good luck spelling that one in elementary school, is doing his best to conquer the known world. And he's sitting on Israel's northern border, getting ready to conquer most of the nation, and he's saying that because he's conquered the world and no one has stopped him, he is essentially a god. Because who's more powerful than him? Who's more mighty than Tiglath-Pileser? If anyone was, they'd stop him from conquering the world. And so far, no one has. And so Israel turns to Isaiah in this moment and says, hey, give us a message of hope. Tell us something good in this moment that will cut through this crisis and make us not have to wrestle with this anymore. And what Isaiah gives is 43 chapters of judgment saying that Assyria is actually going to conquer Israel. So, hooray. But right in the middle of this message of judgment and bashing Israel's king, he drops this passage that gives hope. He gives this one short hope oracle. And it's this passage that we read that talks about how there's going to be this coming king who is going to be sent by God, who is not going to be able to be conquered by Assyria like Israel's king will be conquered. And Isaiah says that he is a mighty God. And there's our hope. But that hope kind of falls short, doesn't it, right? To Israel, Isaiah is saying, God's a mighty God, and one day he'll send somebody after you've been conquered and taken over. It's unhelpful. And it kind of feels the same way in 2020, right? When we talk about like, hey, our hope is that God is a mighty God, it's one thing to say that. It's another thing to experience it, because if I'm honest with myself, God has not felt or seemed very mighty in 2020. And I know I'm up here on the stage and I'm supposed to be like, hey, no, it's great, but in my home, my marriage, in my relationships, in my career, God has not felt or seemed very mighty this year. And I know that's probably the story of most of us in the room. So what are we supposed to do with this idea that God is a mighty God, but it doesn't seem like he's doing anything, right? If God is so mighty, why won't he stop coronavirus? If God is so mighty, why won't he give us good leadership, or end racism, or civil unrest, or fix my job loss, or make my career better, or heal my marriage, or change my kids, right? We can go down that list of like, man, if God is so mighty, why isn't he doing any of this? And that's the way Isaiah's audience would have felt, right? If God is so mighty, why is he going to let this king who thinks he's a god conquer us? We have to wrestle with that question, but the reality is, when we think mighty God, we have some cultural baggage that we have to unpack that shifts and colors our understanding of this passage. Because see, for a lot of us, when we think mighty God, we think that mighty God is a statement about God's abilities and his potential, right? If you're a 90s Christian kid, you know the song, "My God is so big, so strong, and so mighty, there's nothing my God cannot do." I've been singing it all week, now it's in your guys' head. Right? Like, we think that mighty God is really a statement of God's potential, right? There's nothing God can't do, so if there's nothing God can't do, why won't he do X, Y, Z? But what Isaiah is trying to show us in this passage, and trying to show the nation of Israel in this passage, is that mighty God doesn't describe God's potential, it describes God's position. When Isaiah is talking about there is a mighty God, he's talking about how there is a God who cannot be conquered by this king. This king who thinks he's a god from Assyria is not the ultimate power and authority in the universe, even though he thinks he might be. And this is a really common struggle throughout human history. This is actually kind of the core struggle of the Bible and of our lives as followers of Jesus, right? Will we believe that God is the only one who's worthy of our allegiance and attention and affection and our love because he alone is the mighty God, or will we give that allegiance to someone else or something else? This is the central tension of the Bible, right? Because on page 1 or 2, we see the first humans decide that they really don't want to give their allegiance to God. They want to give it to themselves, and dysfunction results. And so the struggles of Scripture that we see again and again and again is God asking different groups of people, hey, will you trust me, and will you give me your attention and affection and worship me as the mighty God rather than something else so that I can bless you? Or will you try to define good and evil and right and wrong on your own and make something else that can't actually do what you want it to do, that can't bear the weight of your loyalty and worship, a mighty God? And I could go to tons of different passages in Scripture to illustrate that, but I want to take us to one that really kind of sums all of this up. And it's in the book of Revelation, which I know right there you're like, you are a lunatic taking the Christmas series to Revelation. Well, if Tanner can make Christmas about spiritual disciplines, I can make Christmas about Revelation. So bear with me is all I'm asking. Let me take off my pastor hat and put on my professor hat for a minute, because before we dive into this passage, I want to talk about how we should read and approach Revelation. Okay, so if you are like me, you probably grew up thinking that Revelation is kind of this roadmap to the end of the world. That's at least what I was told, right? I read the Left Behind books. I was terrified, right? I'm told that like Revelation is the story of how the world ends with like nuclear warfare and, you know, Mad Max mixed with Terminator and the highways paved with human skulls. And I was like, okay, this is terrifying. I don't want to read this. And it didn't help that the people who like really, really loved Revelation were the ones who would get up and be like, okay, let's figure out which politician we don't like is the Antichrist. Or, you know, is it barcodes on our groceries or chips on our credit cards that's the mark of the beast? And so for me, I was kind of like, okay, Revelation is for other people. And I'll read, Matthew, Mark, Luke, maybe Romans. But I had this shift where I realized that, well, that is a way of reading and interpreting Revelation. I don't necessarily think it's the best way. I don't think it's the most helpful way. Because, see, Revelation is a very distinct type of literature in the New Testament, and it's called apocalyptic literature. And here's what apocalyptic literature is. And if you're an Institute student, take really good notes, because this will actually be on a test next semester. So apocalyptic literature are symbolic stories which reveal the hidden spiritual realities of the world around us. Okay, now, I know that's like, what do you mean by that? When John is writing Revelation, what John is trying to do is he's trying to show us the spiritual fabric of the world we inhabit. He's trying to pull back the veil on reality and say, hey, you think you live in a spiritually neutral world, but you don't. There is another realm to our existence where there is a battle taking place every single day. And what John's doing is he's pulling back the curtain and he's saying, hey, here's what this battle looks like. And he's doing it in this really vivid, evocative, symbolic language that's trying to get us to not just understand, but to feel the weight of the world we live in. And so when we approach Revelation, really, instead of asking, what is this symbol and what does it mean and when will it show up on CNN, we should be asking, okay, what story is John trying to tell with all of these symbols? And what does that story reveal about the world we live in? Now, I'm going to be a professor again and assign reading from the stage. If you're like, wow, that all sounds like heresy, I've never heard that before, there's a book called Reading Revelation Responsibly by Michael Gorman that's really where I'm drawing all of this. And it really helped shift my understanding of Revelation from crazy book about the end of the world to really one of the cornerstones of my understanding of what it looks like to follow Jesus in a world that doesn't want me to. And so that's the approach we have to take as we go into this passage. Is John is showing us the threat that we're up against, right? The battle that we face of trying to follow Jesus in this not spiritually neutral world. And look what it says in Revelation 13, verse 11. John says, "Then I saw another beast come up out of the earth. He had 2 horns like those of a lamb, but he spoke with the voice of a dragon." Okay, again, this is all like evocative, and John's trying to paint a picture with some symbols. "He exercised all the authority of the first beast, and he required all the earth and its people to worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. He did astounding miracles, even making fire flash down to the earth from the sky while everyone was watching. And with all the miracles he was allowed to perform on behalf of the first beast, he deceived all the people who belonged to this world. He ordered the people to make a great statue of the first beast, who was fatally wounded and then came back to life. He was then permitted to give life to this statue so it could speak. Then the statue of the beast commanded that anyone refusing to worship it must die." What is John saying? This, again, sounds like a bad burrito. This sounds like some sort of crazy, lunatic vision. But what John is doing is he's trying to show us the spiritual temperature of the world we inhabit. What John is trying to show us in this moment is the battles that we face as followers of Jesus. Because what John's doing is he's actually reaching back into the Old Testament and drawing on a tradition of portraying the world as an area of conflict between beasts. John's specifically going back to Daniel 7, where Daniel has this vision of these monsters that come up out of the sea. And these monsters are these nations, they're these powers, these kingdoms, these authorities and rulers that try to set themselves up as God. Right? They get up and they try to take the worship that God deserves and that God is worthy of, and they try to take it for themselves. And so John has this image from Daniel 7 in mind when he gives us this passage. And what John's trying to show us is that we live in a world where there are worldly powers that want to form our loyalty and our loves. We don't live in a world that's spiritually neutral. We don't live in a world that wants us to worship and follow Jesus. We live in a world that is actively trying to convince us to worship anything other than God. And here's what I mean by powers, right? Because powers sounds kind of like oogie boogie, like I'm some weird conspiracy theorist. But powers are institutions or organizations or entities that offer us hope in exchange for our attention and our affection. Let me get this like real kind of ground level. See, because when John's talking about this, the powers of the world for his audience would have been idols and temples. And of course, we're enlightened, 21st century Americans, so we don't have idols in temples, we have idols on screens. Because see, what winds up happening is, we live in a world where there are organizations that give us, and institutions, and even individual entities that paint a picture of a good life. For me, the number one power that does that is social media. Right? Because when I open up my phone and I log into social media, I get a picture of a good life. It's a life of travel, a life of luxury, a life of beautiful fit people, a life of an espresso machine that costs more than my car. Maybe that's just specific to me, but they target ads really well. Right? Like I get a picture of a good life. Of a life that social media says, man, this is what you should devote your attention to. This is what you should chase after. This is what you should love, right? Another power that shapes my picture of the good life is my career, right? I have a picture of where I want to go in my career, and it says, man, if you will just give all your attention and all your effort and all your work to this career progression, man, you'll have that life that you want. You'll have a picture of a life that you will love. And then these powers say, and all you have to do to get that, like to get that good life that we're painting this picture of, is you just have to let us give it to you. Right? Like you just have to say that we got it, that we're the ones who gave that to you, right? Instagram says, hey, if you want this beautiful square life of food that like is always amazing, become an influencer. Right? Build a following, build a platform. And these powers try to get us to give them our allegiance and our attention and our affection because they want us to really acknowledge them as mighty gods. Right? The powers say, hey, you want a good life? We're the ones who can give it to you. All you have to do is ask. But like we see in this passage that we read with John, one day, the powers that John is talking about, one day they do miracles, right? Like what John's painting this picture of with the beast and the statue that does miracles is the powers try to coerce us, right? Like they try to offer us something so that we'll give them the attention and the worship and the affection and allegiance they crave. But if we won't, they'll try to compel us, right? Anyone who wouldn't worship the beast would die. Try getting rid of Facebook. Like, if I were to say, like, hey, I got rid of my Facebook, you'd be like, so are you going to go live in a cabin in the woods like some sort of Unabomber? Right? Like, if we say, like, hey, I'm actually not into that picture of the good life, then all of a sudden the powers of this world are like, you better. Because otherwise you're not going to give us the worship we want, right? Like, our political institutions are powers of this world. If you don't buy into the picture of the good life that they offer, you're the worst person in the world, and they will beat you down and break you until you acknowledge that your salvation and your good life doesn't come from anything other than getting the right candidate in office and the right people in the courts. And that sort of life doesn't really hurt us when life is good. A life of worshiping the powers doesn't have any visible cost to us, doesn't seem like it's that big a deal when everything's fine. Being an Instagram influencer in 2019 doesn't seem like it has any cost to our souls. But here's the problem with a life given to the picture of the good life that the powers offer us, is that as soon as it meets hardship, as soon as it meets testing, it crumbles. Because here's what we have to realize. The powers of our world are subordinate to another power, and that power is death. All of the lives and the pictures of the good life that the powers of this world offer us are really trying to give us some form of meaning before we encounter death. Which works fine when we're not staring death in the face, but 2020 has been a year of death. Not just a year of physical death, but it's been a year of the death of relationships and dreams and hopes and aspirations, right? There are jobs that we used to have that no longer exist in 2020. There were plans that we had that have died. And the picture of the good life that the powers offer us works when we're not staring death in the face. But when we encounter death, we realize that this good life the powers offer us, not only can it not prevent death, a lot of the times it causes it. When I make my picture of a good life, when I offer my allegiance and attention and affection to my career, guess what? Eventually, that obsession brings death to my marriage. It brings death to my relationship with my kids. It brings death to anything outside of my career, and then when I hit a roadblock or when I hit difficulty and that career crumbles, I have nothing. Same with any power in the world, right? When I give my attention and allegiance to my political party and then we lose an election, and then all it breeds is more anger and death and dysfunction. And this is the world we live in. And this is why it's so important for us to practice the spiritual disciplines that Tanner talked about, because we are being formed. We live in a world where these powers are whispering in our ears saying like, hey, give me the good life. Give me your allegiance and I will give you the good life. But when we encounter death, it crumbles. And I think that's where some of you are at today. I think that's where some of you have been in 2020, is you have tried and tried and tried and tried, and everything that you have put your hope and your dreams and your aspirations and your love into has crumbled, and you don't know where to go from here. Because everything that you've tried to reverse death has just brought more of it. And this is where Jesus steps in. I want to turn back to another passage in Revelation, Revelation 4 and 5. See, Revelation 4 and 5 is actually the key passage of the book of Revelation. Because John talks about this experience and the world that we live in and the world of the powers, but he's viewing it through a very specific lens. Because the first part of Revelation is just a normal series of New Testament letters, but then John has this vision that kicks off the main part of the book in Revelation 4 and 5 that is the central and really centering vision of Revelation that gives us the key to view the rest of the book. And in this vision in Revelation, John is taken up into the throne room of God and he sees what real worship actually looks like. And so in the chapter that we read in chapter 13, John is actually contrasting that false worship of unworthy powers with what he's already seen of true worship in God's throne room. And in Revelation chapter 4, John is taken up into God's throne room and he sees God sitting on his throne with all creation worshiping and adoring and giving praise to him. And then someone stands up and says, "Who can open this scroll?" And the scroll, you'll have to take my word for this, is a symbol of God's plan to rescue and redeem creation from death. And John looks at that scroll and it says that he weeps. Because he knows that there's no one who's capable of opening the scroll. There's no one in heaven or on earth who's capable of rescuing humanity and creation from death and defeating death. So in the middle of this vision, John breaks down sobbing, and then he says that an angel comes up to him and says, Don't weep. There is someone who's worthy to open the scroll, and he sees a lamb that looks like it's been killed. And then in chapter 5, John sees all of the rest of creation worshiping this lamb. And he says, and they sang a new song with these words, "You are worthy to take the scroll and break its seals and open it. For you were slaughtered, and your blood has ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation, and you have caused them to become a kingdom of priests for our God, and they will reign on the earth." And they sang in a mighty chorus, "Worthy is the Lamb who was slaughtered. Not worthy are the powers of this age. Not worthy are the pictures of the good life. Worthy is the Lamb who was slaughtered, to receive power and riches and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and blessing. And then I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea, and they sang blessing and honor and glory and power to the one sitting on the throne and to the Lamb forever and ever. That's our hope. Everything else that we see in this world has to be filtered through the understanding that only Jesus is capable of bearing the weight of our worship. Only Jesus can give us the life that we crave, because, see, as the mighty God, Jesus overcame death through death. See, all of the other powers of this world can't actually overcome death. They can only make it hurt a little bit less. They can only make us forget about it for a little bit. But when they actually face death, their picture of the good life crumbles. But not Jesus. See, when death faces Jesus, death crumbles. When we bring our picture of the good life that the powers of this world try to have us give into, it loses. Right? That good life loses to death, but death loses to Jesus. And this is what the Apostle Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15. And this is actually a passage that I read at every funeral. Because in moments like the death of someone we love, or moments like 2020, Christmas doesn't actually serve to give us the hope that we crave, right? The lights and the trees and what gives us the hope that we need to face death is Easter. Because at our core, we are Easter people. We actually laugh at death because death doesn't have any power over us anymore. And this is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. So you see, just as death came into the world through a man, now the resurrection of the dead has begun through another man. Just as everyone dies because we all belong to Adam, everyone who belongs to Christ will be given new life. But there is an order to this resurrection. Christ was raised as the first of the harvest, then all who belong to Christ will be raised when he comes back. Then look at what Paul says. And then after that, the end will come, when he will turn the kingdom over to God the Father, having destroyed every ruler and every authority and every power. For Christ must reign until he humbles all his enemies beneath his feet. And the last enemy that will be destroyed is death. This is our hope. When we talk about hope being here, our hope is not that the mighty gods of this world will give us something that we crave and then we'll die. Our hope is not even that things will eventually get better. They might get worse. Our hope is not that Jesus will protect us from bad things if we just do the right things and show up to church on Sunday mornings. No, the hope of Jesus as our mighty God is that death doesn't get the last word. Death is not the end of our story. When we talk about the hope that we have, it's that, yes, death is a thing. We're all going to face it. But we don't have to be afraid of it anymore. We don't have to be bullied by it. We don't have to let death influence the decisions that we make for us to try to get everything good out of life before it ends. Because Jesus not only gives us a hope after death that's stronger than the hope the powers offer, he gives us a competing picture of the good life. And that picture of the good life is one where the way to find your life is to lose it. Where the way to experience blessing is to serve others. Where the good life is actually found not in holding on to your life, but laying your life down. Because one day, death isn't going to be a thing anymore. Death isn't going to bully us. Death is going to be defeated, And we'll step into a new creation of life the way God originally designed it to live. And the powers that bully us and deceive us and bring us death when we give them our worship, Jesus will conquer them. He'll put them under his feet. And that's our hope. That is our hope as we go into 2021. Not that a vaccine will come, not that things will get better, not that jobs will come back, but that death will be under Jesus' feet. So what does this mean for you? What does this mean for us as we step into Christmas in 2020, focusing on our hope being that death has been defeated? Well, I think today there are some of you who you just need to have this moment of kind of radical transparency and radical honesty. And you need to ask yourself a really, really hard question that you probably haven't asked in 2020, and that's this: what powers of this world have you made mighty gods? What is it in your life that you have looked to for 2020 and said, man, if I will give this my attention and my allegiance and my affection and my loyalty and my love, I hope it will give me this picture of the good life? What is it that you in 2020 have found lacking, that just has not been able to bear the weight of that good life in a year that's marked by death? And I think there are some of you who have been carrying that all year long, that all year long God has been slowly revealing that to you, that, hey, 2020 is not just God being angry at you, it's not God hating you, it's not God beating you up, it's God trying to open your eyes to something so that you can live a life that isn't bullied by death. And I think today there are some of you who just need to have that moment and confess that to God and say, God, I'm sorry. I have put my hope in something that can't bear that weight. And if that's you, I want to give you an opportunity to respond and come down to the front here and just repent of that. We've got a team that wants to get around you and help you step into what God has that's new. But I think there are also some of you who are here today who have experienced loss in 2020. You have seen the death of things that you love in 2020, of that job, of that career, of that plan, of that relationship, of that dream, of that future. And all you desperately want is to go back to 2019. Your efforts in 2020 have been to try to roll back the clock, have been to try to go back to what used to be when life was good. And I'm here to tell you that's not the way God operates. See, God is not actually a God who brings dead things back to life. Our hope is not that God will revive a rotting corpse, that God's going to go back to 2019 and revive everything that was sick or wasn't helpful or healthy in 2020. No, we serve a God who says that he is making all things new. He doesn't want to bring you back to where you were. He wants to renew you and restore you and transform you and set you up into something different. But to get there, we have to go through death. There is no resurrection without death, right? There is no Easter without Good Friday. And I think there are some of you who have been so just afraid to experience the death of what you care about in 2020. You have been desperately trying to bottle up the grief and hide the mourning because you don't want to let that die so that God can do something new. And I think today, some of you need to mourn that. You need to turn the front of the stage into a graveyard where you're going to bury that dream. You're going to bury that relationship. You're going to bury that aspiration that God killed in 2020, not because he hates you, but because he wants to renew you. He wants to do something in you that he can't if that's there. And we're going to see a picture of that in just a couple minutes when we celebrate baptism. But before we do that, we're going to worship together. We're going to worship the God who has overcome death, who is a mighty God, because there is no one who can conquer him. and he has put all things underneath his feet. And then we're going to be obedient to whatever God asks for us in this moment. So would you stand with me and would you sing to the God who's defeated death?